All right, we start a new series tonight called The End of the Age, reading Matthew 24 in context. So on Sundays for a long time, we did the Gospel of Matthew. And when we finished chapter 23, we stopped and I said, Matthew 24 needs to be a Wednesday night thing because it's a long passage and it's very complex and there's a lot of ideas about it, a lot of debates about it. So it's really better to do that in a setting like this. So that's what we're going to cover. Now, I don't know how long it's going to take us to get through this passage. It'll really just depend on how far we get. You'll notice in the notes, if you go on our website, there's a PDF there that might be easier to read, but it's all in our digital bulletin as well. There's about 14 pages worth of notes and over 6,000 words just for this one chapter. So all that to say, I put a lot of work into this. I've been studying this for quite a while. But we're not going to cover everything in there tonight. So we're just going to see how far we get. Does that sound okay to y'all? Okay. The other thing I want to tell you is don't be afraid to ask questions. But I'll say this before we get started. I'm going to say some things that will make some of you uncomfortable if you're committed to a certain view of the end times. So all I ask is that you hear me out. So let's not argue about it. We can discuss it, but just hear me out first. Don't jump to any conclusions. So I'll give you a couple disclaimers. Okay, how about we start with that? A couple disclaimers. Okay, so the first one, these are in your notes. I just wanted to be real clear about this. There's various views on the end times held by qualified Bible scholars. Okay, so there's really smart people who are legit Bible-believing scholars who hold completely different views on this subject. Okay, so tonight I'm not trying to change your mind. I'm not trying to get you to come in my direction of what my view is. My only job here is to say, here's how I interpret this passage based on my own study, based on the studies of all kinds of people. And I have studied it all different directions. You just have no idea. But I'm not trying to force my view on you at all. Okay. The other thing I'll say is that the earliest Christians, meaning the people who lived in the times of the apostles and shortly after, some of whom knew the apostles, and we have their writings, they also held various views of the end times. Okay? Many of them expressed that they couldn't be sure about the details. So there are certain writers who knew John. That's the writer of Revelation. And they wrote that they didn't understand parts of it. Okay, so if you knew John and you still are struggling, I'm not really sure about this passage in Revelation, then what that tells us is we should probably be pretty humble about how we interpret it. We shouldn't think that we've got the corner on the market. We should think we could be wrong about this. Does that make sense? Right? So if the earliest believers weren't completely sure about everything on this issue, then we should probably be the same way. We should say, kind of looks like this, but it also could be this. I'm not real sure. All right? And that's totally fine. Okay? Nobody's going to heaven or hell based on your view of the end times. You understand that, right? Yes? Okay, good. I might be overdoing this, but I'm just being safe, okay? Now, I want to say this. This is my statement of faith on the issue, okay? I believe that Jesus will return to earth in the future. Now, as we study tonight, you're going to be like, wait a minute, are you saying? Just remember, I said this from the get-go. I believe he is going to come to earth in the future. But I do not believe Matthew 24 is talking about that. I think it's talking about something else. So we're going to dig into that, and you'll see why I think that. And you may have to be here for the next few Wednesdays to get the whole deal, okay? If you miss one, you can watch it online, hopefully. As long as we keep hitting that button, we'll be good. All right. Now, I don't want to bore you with like all the different views of how people interpret the end times. And by the way, we're not really going to be talking about the end times as much tonight because, as I said, I think Matthew 24 is actually talking about something else. Um, but there's basically three main categories of how people think about these things. And I'm not going to bore you with all the charts and all the stuff. I'm going to show you one that you'll be very familiar with because you likely were taught this one particular view. But there's these are big words, okay? You'll learn some big words tonight. Premillennialism is one way of thinking about the end times, and that states that the return of Christ will occur before the millennial reign of Christ. So if you've heard about the 1,000-year reign of Christ in Revelation 20, so they would say Jesus is going to come back to earth, and that's when the millennial reign of Christ will start. So pre-millennial. He comes back pre-millennium. Get it? Okay? So that's one view. And that's probably the majority view, especially in America. Another view is called postmillennialism, and they believe that the 1,000-year reign of Christ happens, and then there's a return of Christ. I know it sounds like it doesn't make sense. There's a whole lot of details behind that, but that's what they think. And then there's a view called amillennialism, which they hold that the millennial reign of Christ began when Jesus ascended into heaven and sat down at the right hand of God. That's when his reign began. And the number 1,000 is a symbol for a long, long period of time, not literally 1,000 years. So that's the amillennial view. Okay, so that's kind of the three things. Now, what you need to know about that is there's some really, really smart, really, really good believers in all three camps. Okay, and there always have been. Okay, it's just always been that way. So what that tells us is we should just be careful. We should say, okay, there may be some truth in all three of these views in some way. Okay, and remember, nobody's getting into heaven or getting sent to hell based on your view of eschatology. There's another big word for you. Eschatology is study of the end. Okay? All right. Well, let's talk about the view you're most familiar with. And I'm going to tell you some things about that. We're going to be uncomfortable for a few minutes. Don't throw anything at me. We good? I'm probably making this worse, but anyway. All right. So this is the popular view of the end times. It's called dispensational premillennialism. So those three views I told you about a minute ago, there's multiple different views under each one. So not only are there three major views where people disagree, but within each view, there are multiple views where people disagree. Sounds great, doesn't it? Right? So this is the most popular view. Now, I greatly simplified this chart because there's much more to it than this. But this is the basic timeline of how this view works. This is what most of us were taught growing up, okay? So Jesus dies on the cross in 32, 33 AD, and that began the church age, right? And then at some point, the church is going to be raptured out into heaven. You've heard of this? Yes? Okay. So if you've seen the movies, we just get raptured out and our clothes stay here. So apparently we go to heaven naked. Because all of our clothes stayed. But anyway, so you get raptured out. I'm making jokes not to make fun of. I'm making jokes so that we stay lighthearted about this, okay? So you get raptured out. By the way, have you ever had a moment in your life where you were afraid that it happened and you got left behind? Anybody? Yeah, it happened to me too. I came home one day from school or from somewhere, and I was probably, 12, maybe 11. Came home, both parents' cars are home, parents aren't home. That had never happened before. I had no idea where they were. Come to find out, they just went for a walk. Nobody told me. There was no cell phones then, because there was a time when we didn't have those. They were just gone. And I literally walked around the house and started thinking, I got left behind. It happened, right? So you know what I did? I turned on the TV and I turned to the news. Nobody else had disappeared. So I was like, okay, maybe I'm good. And then they came back and I was like, you can't do that to me. You got to leave a note, right? So anyway, so there's this rapture. And then when that happens, there will begin 7 years of tribulation on the earth. That'll be the most god awful 7 years you've ever heard of, right? So if you ever seen the Left Behind movies or read the Left Behind series, the novels, they are novels, by the way. It it's based on this view. Okay, so there's these very terrible years of tribulation. During that tribulation, this view states that the temple in Israel will be rebuilt, and God will actually return to dealing with the nation of Israel. Sacrifices will be reinstated, and there's different ideas about it, but the basic idea, the majority view, is that this sacrificial system prepares them to then accept Jesus as their Messiah when he comes back in his second coming. They differ on that. Some people say that's not true. Some, like I said, everybody argues about this. It doesn't matter who you talk to. Okay? So there's a second coming, and then that is when Jesus will set up his literal kingdom on earth for 1,000 years. And then when that's over, there's stuff that happens in the middle, at the end of that, like the big battle, Armageddon, all that stuff. And then there'll be final judgment where God will separate the sheep from the goats, so to speak. He's going to separate the righteous from the unrighteous. And then that's when the new creation happens. Does that sound familiar to you? Yes? Yeah. This is the view I was taught growing up. Now, some really great godly people believe this, some of which are sitting in here right now. So here's just what I'll say about this. I used to completely go along with this when I started studying all of this on my own, especially in Bible college. And I'm not the kind of person that I just listen to what a professor says and I run with it. I've been in this long enough to know everybody's wrong about stuff. So I've been studying this since Bible college, which I graduated 2007. So it's been a minute that I've been researching this stuff, and pretty heavily in the last few years. I don't hold this view anymore. And that doesn't mean I think people who do hold this view are just flat out wrong or don't know how to read their Bible or whatever. That's not what I think. I just don't hold this exact view anymore. There's some things we need to understand about this view. So I want to tell you some facts, and you can just do what you want with them. Okay? So here are the facts about this view. So you should know that this view, the idea of a rapture and then a 7-year tribulation and then a second coming, so rapture and second coming being separate, that's new. Now we think, well, that sounds like the old view. Actually, it's the newest view of the end times. If you go study all throughout church history, read all the writings of the early Christians, which you probably won't do, there's over 4,000 pages written by Christians in the first 4 centuries of the church. Okay, I've spent the last about 3 years really digging into those writings because it tells us a lot about what the early Christians believed. But if you go all the way back that far, you won't find anything like this. Now, I will say this, you'll find differences, but you won't find this at all. If you go all the way through church history, you will not find this view until the year 1830. A guy named John Nelson Darby came up with this view. Until that point, there was not a belief that the rapture and the second coming were 2 different events. Everybody up until 1830 believed those were the same event. So what they believed is that the second coming, we would be taken up to meet the Lord in the air. This is in Thessalonians. And we come down with him as he's coming. So we're taken up, and then we come down with him. The Greek says exactly that, by the way, in that Thessalonians passage. We don't have time to get into all that tonight. We can do that in the future. The important thing to know is this view was unheard of until 1830, until John Nelson Darby. Now, John Nelson Darby, he was the first one to start separating all these events out. And by the way, he's from England. He was a priest in the Church of Ireland for a while, and then after about 2 years, he left the Church of Ireland because he felt like what they were doing wasn't even close to what Scripture was saying. And I would agree. There are many things I agree with him about, just not on this. Um, so he left the Church of Ireland. He went to England. He started a group called the Brethren. You may have heard of the Plymouth Brethren, probably not, but they were a different denomination. They were starting something new. Now, his views, he got so adamant that he was right about this that the Brethren split. Shocking, people, denominations split off. That was not new in 1830, but anyway. Uh, so they split up, and John Darby started a group that was referred to as the Exclusive Brethren, or the Darbyites. How convenient. Um, and their views were so, like, he was the first guy to start saying that Israel and the church are two separate things that God is working with. People didn't think that in history before him. And he was very adamant that that's the way it is, that God is dealing with the church like a parenthesis in his plan, kind of like a plan B, and he's going to go back to plan A, which is Israel in the end times. He was the first one to start teaching that. And he was so adamant on that, and so adamant on this view, and very adamant about how to interpret the Bible, and how everything in the Bible has to be interpreted literally. There's no metaphors, there's no imagery, there's no figurative language. That was his view. That's why all the split happened. So the other group they referred to themselves as the open brethren. We're a little more open-minded about some things. Okay, so now this view didn't take off for a while, but Darby came to the United States, and he did 7 tours in the United States and Canada, speaking at all these different places and events. And that's when it really took off. Us Americans really latched on to his views. Eventually, in the early 1900s, his views made it into the Scofield Reference Bible. Now, if you grew up in a Southern Baptist church, you likely were given one of these at some point, probably at baptism or whatever. All of Darby's views are in the study notes of that Bible, and that's when it really took off. Another guy named Clarence Larkin, who's a very smart man, he was the one who started putting it all in chart form. So if you've ever seen the big end times charts, especially if you watch like John Hagee on TV, he's always got a big chart behind him with all these god-awful images on them. So that Clarence Larkin was the first one to start doing that stuff. He followed Darby's views. Now, I'm telling you all that to tell you that it's the most popular view here, but it's not the only view, and it's not the view held by most Bible scholars. People who spend their life studying Scripture in its original language and context, most of them don't follow this view. It's mostly just a popularized idea here. If you get on a plane and actually leave America, which you probably can't do right now if you're not vaccinated, but anyway, if you were to do that, you would find out that in much of the world they don't believe this. They have completely different views. So just keep that in mind, that I know this is what most of us were taught growing up. You can still believe this if you want to. It doesn't matter to me either way. It really doesn't, because here's the truth about the whole issue of the end times. In the end, we're all going to believe the same thing. Right? Because it's going to happen and we're going to go, oh, that's how it goes. And it's not like Jesus is going to be like, yeah, and now you get to go to hell because you didn't believe in the rapture, right? That's not how it's going to work out. It's going to happen how God wants it to happen. Like my professor in college said, he was a pan-millennialist. He said it's all going to pan out, right? So, and that's not to say it doesn't matter. I'm just saying it's not an eternal issue. We can differ on this. All right? So now that everybody's completely uncomfortable, we'll move along. Now, there's basically 2 problems. There's a lot more than 2, but there's 2 big problems with modern studies of eschatology, especially popular versions of it. The stuff like you would see on TBN or things like that, the big Christian networks. They all mostly go by this view. But 2 things. One, context is often ignored. Sometimes we'll pull scripture out and say, see, that's where this happens. But we didn't read anything around it to find out that's actually not what it's talking about at all. So context is often ignored when we're studying end times. You see this on Facebook a lot, especially nowadays, right? They come out with a vaccine and people's pulling out passages from all over the place. Oh, this is the mark of the beast and all that. Now, I will say this. The vaccine mandate thing got me wondering because it looked pretty similar, okay? But it's most likely not the mark of the beast, okay? We'll get to that in Revelation that we're getting into later. So context is often ignored, and then the big problem that I see is that historical events are often unknown or ignored. Now, let's come outside the Bible for a minute into America. Isn't it a problem in our culture that the upcoming generation doesn't know history? Right? You've seen those videos where they're interviewing people who are voting and you hear their answers? They know nothing about history, right? That's a problem. Yes? Okay. The same is true for Bible study. Most Christians do not know anything about Christian history or biblical history. And that causes us to read certain texts the wrong way. Okay? So what we're going to do for this particular series is I want to walk you through Matthew 24, and I'm just going to tell you some things that happened in history, and we're going to see if maybe that's what Jesus was talking about, not the end of the world off into the future somewhere. Okay? There's a reason why I called this series The End of the Age, and we're going to get into that in just a minute. All right. So, we good so far? Okay, now, so Matthew 24, and if you remember when we were in the Matthew series on Sunday, I told you that Matthew in chapters 21 through 24, he really seems to be following the same flow of Isaiah chapter 5. So here's what I did. I made you a nice little chart, okay? If we look at what Matthew's doing and we go to Isaiah 5, it looks almost the same, okay? So Isaiah 5 starts out with a parable about Israel is like a vineyard, right? Well, Matthew in 21 records Jesus telling a parable about a vineyard, and it almost is the same exact parable. I mean, some of the details are a little bit different. It's Old Testament to New Testament, but it's the same storyline, okay? So in that parable, the leaders of Israel are not doing the right things, and Israel has produced stinky, rotten grapes. That's what Isaiah says. And in Matthew, Jesus is saying the same thing. Then in Isaiah 5, there's 6 woes against Israel. He pronounces 6 woes. And Jesus does that in Matthew 23, except he does 7. What does the number 7 mean? Completion, culmination, right? So it's as if Jesus is trying to say, this is it. This is it, Israel. Okay? Isaiah chapter 5 ends with, I put Israel will be destroyed, but actually it's the city will be destroyed. It's talking about Jerusalem. And in Matthew 24, that's exactly what Jesus is talking about, is the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple. So the reason I'm telling you that is because if that's what Matthew seems to be doing, then whatever's going on in this destruction is probably similar to what Jesus is talking about in Matthew. Make sense? Okay? Just saying, if you go read these 2 passages side by side, I love doing that on my computer. I bring up Isaiah 5, Matthew 24, and you can just see they're doing the same thing. Okay? All right. Now, cake, I tell you, I'm out of breath. All right, let's go to Matthew then. If you've got a Bible, turn there. I guess I need to make that larger, don't I? All right, now, we could start in Matthew 24, but if we want to know the context, we might want to back up into chapter 23. Because here's something you may not know about your Bible. Those numbers in there, like chapter numbers and verse numbers, they weren't in the original. That was added like 2,000 years later, okay? So, sorry, not 2,000, like 1,500 years later. So in the original, this was all part of the same passage. So here's how it starts. This is Jesus talking. He's just pronounced 7 woes on Israel's leaders, the Pharisees. He says, "O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the city that kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to it." Let me get my pen going here. I'm sorry. Okay, so what do you think the context of this passage is going to be? Jerusalem, yes. Okay. How often, now listen to what Jesus is saying here. How often would I have gathered your children together as a hen gathers her brood under her wings? You see the compassion in what he's saying? I really wanted you to get it right. I really wanted you to listen to me. Okay? But you are not willing. And he says, "See, your house." Now, if you know your context here, in Matthew 21 to 24, Jesus is in the temple for most of that whole section. It's only in 24 does he walk out of the temple and go somewhere else. So in chapter 23, he says, "Look, your house, your temple, is left to you desolate." That's an important word to remember. Okay, so what are we supposed to be hearing Jesus say? Your temple is going to be left desolate, empty, ruined, destroyed. That's what this word means. He says, "For I tell you, you will not see me again until you say, 'Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord.'" Okay? Now, right before this, I didn't have it in these notes, but it's in your notes in your outline. In the woes section, he says this to the Pharisees. He's telling them, you guys killed the prophets and all this stuff. He says, "Look, all this is going to happen to you, so that on you may come all the righteous blood shed on the earth, from the blood of righteous Abel to the blood of Zechariah, who was a prophet, whom you murdered between the sanctuary and the altar." Israel's leaders killed one of their prophets in the temple. And he says, "Look, on you is going to come all the judgment for all of those prophets that you've killed." Okay? So when he says on you, who's he talking to? He's talking to the people standing there listening to him, the Pharisees, right? The 7 woes are on the Pharisees, and they're in the crowd listening. All right, that's important. We'll come back to it. So the context is Jerusalem here. And then in Matthew 24, Jesus left the temple and was going away when his disciples came to point out. What are they pointing out? Well, sorry, let me put my scroll back in the right direction here. To point out the buildings of the temple. Okay, so they've just heard him say, "This beautiful temple that y'all been working on for over 40 years to get it all beautiful and just how you want it, yeah, that's going away. It's going to be completely desolate." All right? And they knew what that term meant because this has happened in their history before. They knew their history. Israelites knew their history. Americans don't, but Israelites do. Okay? They know their temple's been destroyed in the past. So when they heard him say that, they thought, "What? You mean our temple? This big temple, this big complex that's 1,200 feet by 900 feet, this thing is coming down?" So here's what they do. They start walking around the complex with Jesus, and they're pointing out, like, look how big these stones are. I mean, how can you throw that stone off the wall? I mean, it's huge. Like, look at all these buildings. Now, you need to know this too. Mark chapter 13 tells the same story that we're going to read tonight in Matthew 24, and Luke 21. And it's important that you take all 3 of those into account, okay, because things are in different orders and things like that. So there's 3 different accounts of what Jesus said, all right? So he says, "Look, Jesus, look at all these buildings." But he answered them. He said, "Yeah, you see all these? I say to you, there will not be here one stone left upon another that will not be thrown down. It's all coming down. Make sense? Okay, so you get the idea that what Jesus is talking about in this chapter is the destruction of the entire temple complex, right? Okay, I'm just making sure we got the right context. Okay, now as he sat on the Mount of Olives, okay, so now they're not in the temple anymore. They've moved out of the temple complex and they're on the Mount of Olives. Now, this is the view from the Mount of Olives. That's a temple complex. Okay, so they had just been walking around this big thing. Remember, 1,200 feet by 900 feet. Walking around this thing, and the disciples are like, look at all this, Jesus. Look how big this is. Look at all this great stuff. What do you mean? What do you mean it's going to be destroyed? They go out of there. They come out this little door and go down the steps, and they go out to the Mount of Olives, where this is the view. Beautiful view. Okay? And that's where this whole conversation is about to take place. Okay? So we got that in our head. Just imagine you're on the Mount of Olives, and you're having a conversation with Jesus, and you're looking at this. Okay? So what do you think Jesus is talking about if you're sitting with him looking at that? You think he's talking about that. Because he just was talking about that. Okay? Now, the disciples came to him privately. They kind of pulled Jesus to the side. Now, if you go read Mark chapter 13, it tells you right off the bat which disciples had this discussion. It was Peter, James, John, and Andrew. So 2 sets of brothers, Peter and Andrew, James and John. Those were the 4. Could have been more, but that's what we're told. All right, so these 4 guys for sure came to him privately, and they said, all right, Jesus, tell us, when will these things be? When's this going to happen? What are these things? What are these things they're asking about? The destruction of the temple. Yes? Okay. And how are we going to know? What will be the sign? So is there going to be anything that will tell us ahead of time that this is about to happen? You get it? He says, what will be the sign of your coming and the end of the age? Now, the reason why, I've spent a lot of time trying to figure out why most people read this passage and think it's about the end of the world. There's a lot of reasons for that, but I think one of the biggest reasons is the most popular translation of the Bible, the King James Version, and I'm not knocking the King James Version, but it translates this word world. Okay? So it sounds like Jesus is talking about the end of the world if you're reading the King James Version. Now, the problem with that is, that's not what the Greek says. The Greek uses the word aeon, which means age, a defined period of time, which is how the Israelites thought about time. They thought of it in ages. Okay? This is one thing I do like about dispensationalism, is they do get the idea right that there are periods of time where different things happen throughout biblical history. That makes sense. That's definitely a biblical concept. But I think sometimes they go too far in certain parts of it. Now, if it meant to say the end of the world, it would have used the word cosmos. If it was talking about the entire globe, the entire world, it would have been talking about cosmos in Greek. But that's not what it says. Okay, so we're talking about the end of the age. That's why we called the series that, or why, I'll say we, me. That's why I called the series the end of the age. Okay? All right, Jesus, you said everything's coming down. All right, when's that going to happen? And what are going to be the signs of it? Now, Matthew's writes the question longer than both Mark and Luke. In Mark 13 and Luke 21, the question's much shorter. It just says, when will these things be and what will be the sign? Right? It doesn't say anything about your coming or the end of the age. It just says, when's this going to happen and how are we going to know it's coming? That's the question. Okay? Now for Matthew in his mind, he's writing down a little bit more detail there. All right, verse 4. And Jesus answered them. He says, now see that no one leads you astray. Now the reason why I circled the word you is because we need to know who you is. Who is you? Peter, James, John, and Andrew. It's not you. So when we read that, we think, well, it's you. That's talking about me. No, in context, he's talking to those four people who are asking the question. He says, when you see what I'm about to describe to you. Okay? That's very important for how you interpret the passage. Does that make sense? Okay? See that no one leads you astray. So apparently these four guys are going to be in danger of being led astray. He says, for many will come in my name, saying, I am the Christ. I'm going to make you nervous here. When someone comes in Jesus' name saying, I am the Christ, that means they're kind of like an anti-Christ. Now, if that makes you nervous, just realize your Bible tells you there are multiple antichrists. Just read 1 John. Might be 2 John. One of the little Johns. Okay? The Gospel of John, I call that Big John. And then 1st, 2nd, 3rd John, those are little Johns. Okay? Somebody. Zach, laugh. Thank you. Okay? In one of those, he talks about how there are many antichrists already there. They're already going on in the first century. Okay? So I'm not pulling something crazy out at you. If someone comes saying, I am Christ, they're an antichrist. Why? Because they are not Christ. Make sense? Okay. Okay, so they're going to come saying, I'm the Christ, and they will lead many astray. And you will hear of wars. Who's going to hear of wars? The four guys asking the question. Okay. And you will hear of wars and rumors of wars. But see that you are not alarmed. Don't be afraid. For this must take place. But the end is not yet. Remember they asked about the end of something, the end of an age, right? Like, don't be afraid. When wars start breaking out and there's false prophets running around saying that they're the Messiah, but just don't get scared. Just don't be led astray, but don't get scared. All this stuff's got to happen, okay? For nation will rise against nation, kingdom against kingdom, and there'll be famines and earthquakes in various places. Now, what you need to understand is that in the first century, you know what? I skipped a whole thing, and you might be lost right now. So let me explain this first. In the first century, from the year 66 to 70 AD, there was a massive war in the land of Israel. It was all over the place, but it concentrated in the last 5 months on Jerusalem. And in that war, there was all kinds of things going on. We're going to talk about it more next week. Okay, I'm actually going to take you through what all was going on so that we can see it clearly. That war is recorded in brutal detail by a guy named Josephus. You probably heard me say his name before. This is some of his writings. In his book, The Wars of the Jews, he describes it in painful detail. The reason he could do that is because he was there. He was one of the people who were taken prisoner by the Romans. He was a general in the Israeli army. He was over the area of Galilee. So he was an eyewitness. So he wrote all this down from Rome. When he was a slave to Rome, he was commissioned to write all this stuff down and tell the whole story. So he did. It's very long. It's very graphic. You don't want to read that right after you eat. Stuff in there will turn your stomach. But he describes this period of time between 66 and 70 AD. Long story short, it was a 3.5 year long war. And at AD 70, General Titus, who's a Roman general, completely defeated the Israelites, completely tore the city to the ground, completely desecrated the temple, which we'll get to in a little bit, and burned it to the ground. Josephus records that around 1.1 million people died during that time period in that war. 97,000 were taken off to Rome as slaves, as prisoners of war. And they were paraded down the streets of Rome in shame. So that happened, okay? He also records that in that time and leading up to that time, there were all kinds of wars breaking out all around Israel. So you will hear wars and rumors of wars. That happened, okay? There was also famines. Some of them are recorded in Acts. One of them for sure is recorded in Acts where there was a massive famine. Actually, one of the reasons that Paul went on one of his missionary journeys was to raise money for the believers in Jerusalem because the famine was so bad. So all these churches he's going to, he's taking a collection to go back to Rome to provide for the believers there. Right? You might not have known that, but that's what Paul was up to. So all these things were happening in the first century. He said, all these are but the beginning of birth pains. So ladies, you understand he's talking about some painful stuff here. He says, then they will deliver you. Who is you? Okay, the four. I think you're all getting it now. Yeah. And they will put you to death. Now, were the apostles put to death? Yeah, all of them except for John. John lived longer. He died in old age. And you will be hated by all nations for my name's sake. And then many will fall away. As persecution gets bad, there's a lot of people just going to say, you know what, I don't believe in Jesus anymore. I want to keep my house. I want to keep my farmland. I want to keep my life. So they just completely recant their faith. That happened as well. And they'll betray one another. And they'll hate one another. And many false prophets, there's those guys again, they will arise and lead many astray. And lawlessness will be increased. And the love of many will grow cold. That's probably as far as we're going to be able to get tonight. But the question is, all these things that Jesus is going to talk about in Matthew 24, the question is, did he ever answer the question, when? You say no? I say yes. He did say when. He just didn't say exactly when. Look at this verse. Look at verse 34 of chapter 24. He says, truly I say to you, now this is after he's talked about the wars and the tribulation, the false prophets and lawlessness and the abomination of desolation, which we'll probably have to get to next week. The coming of the Son of Man on the clouds. He's already talked about all that. And then he says this, truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. So he says within a generation. Now a biblical generation, especially in the New Testament, is 40 years. So here's what Jesus is saying. 40 years from the time I'm telling you this is going to happen. Before 40 years is up, these things will take place. So he gives them a time frame, but he goes on to say, but concerning the day and the hour, no one knows. Now you've probably been taught that all that's about the end of the world. And I understand that. And you can still hold that view if you want to. I'm just saying that within the context, that wouldn't have made any sense to these four guys asking the questions. For Jesus to look at them in the eyes and say, when you see these things. Make sense? Okay? So, like I said, a lot of stuff in here sounds like the end of the world and the second coming of Jesus. It's actually not talking about that. It's talking about God's judgment on Israel. Okay? So we're going to continue to walk through this as we go. and we'll get to that same thing I just read to you about this generation will not pass away. We're going to dig into that in more detail. But what I want to do for you tonight is to set you up and say, okay, now I want you to start reading this passage in that context. Now, how many of you read it before you got here tonight? Okay, a few of you. The rest of you didn't do it at all. That's try harder. Okay. So here's what I want you to do this week. I want you to read this passage again, and I want you to imagine that you're Peter or James or John or Andrew, or if you're a lady, maybe you can be Mary or somebody else. I don't know. Martha, I don't know. Some of you are Marthas, but okay. All right, never mind. So I want you to read this passage this week, and every time you see the word you, I want you to be thinking about those four guys, not you. Because if Jesus was talking to you, that would have been really confusing for those four guys. Because he was telling them they would see these things. Yes? Okay. So this week, I want you to go back and read that passage again. Now here's what I know some of you are going to do. You're going to get onto Google, and you're going to try to find all the ammunition you can against that. And I just want you to understand, you're going to find all kinds of stuff on Google. And half of it is crazy. Okay? Just read your Bible. If you go on YouTube, you're going to find everybody telling you how to read this passage. I've just told you, this is how you read in context. The you is not you. The you is those four guys who are asking the questions who Jesus is looking at. So this week, I want you to read that passage and see if you can figure out, what is Jesus talking about? He's not talking about the end of the world. He's talking about the end of what they were looking at. Then what does this actually mean? And just think through that this week. And do it this time. Okay? And then we'll come back next week and we'll dig into the next part of it. Sound good? Okay. Questions? Peter, James, John, and Andrew. I'm just making sure I got that right. Mark 13, verse 3 tells you that. Peter, James, John, and Andrew asked him privately. Yep. When you read through this passage, you're going to see different categories of things that Jesus is talking about. You're going to see signs on earth, things that are going to happen on earth. And then you're going to see signs in the heavens, in the skies. Okay? So you're going to see that change as you read. I want you to read really close. Okay? Don't just skim through it and go, well, I don't know. No, this was written for you to understand. Okay? So just walk through it and see if you can figure out what's going on there. Pay attention to where the things are happening, who's Jesus talking to, and I think you're going to learn some new stuff by doing it this way. This is how you read your Bible in context. Okay? Now, if you have a digital Bible, it's a lot easier to do on a digital Bible. I want to show you how to do this right quick. So I'm just going to go to my Faith Life Study Bible. Sorry, that was the wrong app. Where is it? Faith Life Study Bible. This is a great Bible, by the way. No, I don't want to rate your app. So like if you go to Matthew 24. Now some of you who've been in church and reading the Bible a long time, you already know this, but some of us in here don't. Dang, you can't see that. If you pay attention, you'll see these little letters within the text telling you there's some kind of footnote, right? In your app, if you touch one of them, it'll pop up and tell you another verse where either that concept or that word or that phrase has been used. So what you can do is then click on that and it'll pop up and you can read it right there. Okay? And then you can hit the jump to reference and go read it all in context. But that's called a reference. So a reference Bible will include this. Now I've got a journaling ESV Bible right here and it doesn't have any of that stuff because it's trying to leave room for all this hieroglyphics I want to do in my Bible. But a study Bible will do that. Your paper Bibles do it too. It's just a little more work. You have to go find where that letter is and find the reference and then flip to it. It's a lot easier in an app. Almost any, I think the YouVersion app, it has the same thing. You can just click the footnote and then hit the reference. So when you're reading through Matthew 24 on your device, you'll see little footnotes everywhere. Just click them and then go read those passages. It'll help you understand what's going on, especially when he's talking about the abomination of desolation spoken of by the prophet Daniel. There'll be a footnote there. Click it and go read Daniel. So I didn't know if you were aware of that. I know a lot of us in here are, but if you're new to this Bible study thing, that's a really helpful tool because it helps the Bible interpret the Bible, right? Because it does interpret itself if you know where to go look. So, all right, I'm done talking. Questions? Anybody got any questions at all? It's mentioned that there were antichrists already working by John and Little John. But there are very clear examples in this guy's account of the war. And in the notes, I've included references to this and exactly where to find it. So you can read this online, I'm pretty sure. If you just Google Josephus, War of the Jews, and on every time I mention or quote him in the notes, I'll give you the reference. So what you'll see in the notes is you'll see like 6.2.218 to 219. That's book 6, chapter 2, and lines 198 to 199 or whatever, okay? I've got a lot of stuff underlined in here because I've been reading this stuff for a while now, but there were many prophets recorded in here that were trying to lead people out into the wilderness to be their followers. There was one group that one guy led a whole group of people up on top of the temple and was telling them that God was going to come get them and save them from the war, and they all died. There's lots of examples. So yeah, there's recorded history of false prophets coming and saying, "I'm the Messiah, follow me, follow me." Exactly how Jesus said it would. So. Now that actually is a possibility. So the question, and I put this at the very end of the notes, but we didn't get that far. Okay, so if Matthew 24 already happened, then what are we waiting on? That's the question. Well, you still got a whole nother book of the Bible called Revelation, and there's stuff in there that hadn't happened yet. Okay, so what Jesus is describing here, also some of it's described in Revelation. When we study Revelation, I'm going to show you a bunch of stuff that you probably never heard before that connects things in history that Revelation is directly speaking to. But it's not all happened yet. There's still events to come. Okay, the return of Christ to the earth is still yet to come. That has not happened. Now, the coming of the Son of Man, which is Jesus, in judgment over Jerusalem, that happened in AD 70. Okay, just as Jesus described it. And by the way, there's a lot of things in here where some really weird stuff was happening in the clouds during the war. We're going to talk about that next week. So we've got historical documentation that some very weird things were happening in the clouds during the war over the city of Jerusalem. Okay? And not just this guy. There's also a Roman historian who said the same things. Those two guys don't know each other. No, Josephus is a Jew. He was I think he was a Pharisee. And he really wasn't a historian until after all this happened, and the Romans, who were his captors, said, "We need you to write down a detailed account." But he was a Jew. He did not believe Jesus was the Messiah. He does write about Jesus in here, but you can tell he did. He just considered him another person who claimed to be the Messiah. So what that means is this is an unbiased account. Now, if this guy was a Christian, I would say I don't know if we can trust that, because he might just be reading Matthew 24 and making up his own history to make it look like it happened. But the fact that this guy didn't believe what Jesus said and never heard what Jesus said, it's pretty convincing that he's writing the truth. So then plus you've got Roman historians that back up the story. So now if you didn't know this AD 70 thing that happened where the temple was destroyed and Jerusalem was torn up, that wasn't the first time that happened. That was like the third time. So you had one time it happened in 586 or 587 BC when the Babylonians took Jerusalem and they took Israel into exile. Remember how we talked about exile in the Genesis series, that if you don't obey me, there's going to be exile coming. Just like they were exiled from the garden, Israel gets exiled from the promised land into Babylon and Assyria. So that happened in 586, 587 BC. In the intertestament period, which you can read about in your Septuagint if you would buy one, in First Maccabees, he tells you about Antiochus Epiphanes, who came in and tore down the temple and had pigs sacrificed in the Holy of Holies. Now, the Jews like pigs. No, it's off limit. You don't even touch them. Now, not only was Antiochus doing that, he was forcing Jews to do it, to sacrifice pigs in the temple. That was in the intertestament period. And it was torn up then too. So AD 70 was not the first time this occurred. Most Bible readers don't know any of that history, and that's a problem. That's a problem. We should know the history of the things we say we believe in. Just like you should know the history of your country if you're going to vote. That's all I'm going to say about that. Okay? All right. I'm going to pray for us, and then I'll hang out here. I'm sure we'll be here late tonight, and that's totally fine with me. I love this stuff. I love helping you. I love learning from you. Sometimes you ask me things, and I'm like, I hadn't thought about that. And I actually go back and study it, and I learn some stuff. So that's why the church exists, so we can do this. Okay? That's why we're doing Wednesday night, because Sunday is not exactly what Jesus had in mind. Sunday's good, but it's not enough. We actually are supposed to do what we're doing in here, discussing and learning together. So, all right, let me pray and I'll let you go home.